would have been, I'm grateful for your help. Let me say that.
We are
Um,
too.
yes, because I wouldn't have been able to do this without you. All right. Well, Rabbi, I can't see you, but that's okay.
Okay.
Um, whenever you're ready to start, we can
Okay.
start.
Okay. So I'll start. My name is Rabbi Steven Morgen. I'm one of the rabbis at Congregation Beth Yeshurun. Welcome everybody to this evening. This is the first of a three-part series of interfaith dialogues. We try to do the series every year. And this year, my partner and my new friend, Reverend Johnie Jones, and I are going to present to you the topic is love your neighbor, as you can see on your screen. Love your neighbor as yourself, and the parable of the Good Samaritan. So I'll let him introduce himself first, and then I'll say a little bit more about me and why we chose this topic, and then we'll get into the conversation. So take it away, Reverend Johnie.
Awesome. Well, Rabbi, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. You are and have been certainly a dear friend, and I'm grateful to participate in this very important conversation, especially in light of the recent presidential election. And I think I'm most excited about exposing our audience or our friends publicly to a conversation that you and I have had privately over the course of several months. Listen, you know this about me. I don't like talking about myself, but I'll just share a little bit about me. I'm from a small town called Hope, Arkansas, and come from a long line of Christian pastors and individuals who have dedicated their lives to public service. My dad is a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor for more than 30 years before he passed. Is my video not showing? Okay, what
Yeah,
about
there
now?
you can see yourself. We have right now. You can.
Okay, is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
So my dad is a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor for more than 30 years before he passed, and my great grandfather was a itinerant pastor, and my mother is currently a minister in the Christian faith, and recently retired after nearly 30 years of service as a juvenile probation officer and mental health counselor. And my grandmother, Catherine Thomas, affectionately known as Big Mama, had 9 children of her own, but served as the first female mayor of her town, campaigned in rural Arkansas for the first Clinton campaign, and worked tirelessly to run 2 daycare centers for single working mothers to ensure they had access to affordable childcare. And so I'm going to fast forward so that I don't bore our audience. But after graduating from Yale Divinity School, I knew I wanted to either serve as an executive pastor of a mega church, which I was afforded the opportunity to do so in Hockley, Texas. And I must say that was a worthwhile experience, but I also had an interest in serving as an executive director of a nonprofit organization. So in July of this year, I was afforded the opportunity to be appointed the new executive director of Bread of Life Incorporated, a nonprofit located in downtown Houston, founded nearly 30 years ago by pastors Rudy and Juanita Rasmus. And it was originally focused on providing support to homeless men and women in the downtown area. And since then, we've shifted our missional focus towards individuals and families who have been impacted by life's disasters, and through services such as rapid case case management, access to healthy food. For example, every Wednesday, we serve food to roughly anywhere between 700 and 1,200 families. And most recently, we've collaborated with Precinct 1, Commissioner Rodney Ellis, and several other healthcare agencies to do our part to flatten the COVID curve. And so with that being said, I just want to say how excited I am to be here today.
Right. So obviously your mission now is truly living out the what we consider the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. You're really living that life right now.
Exactly.
And I actually gave a sermon that I talked quite a bit about that commandment on the high holidays, what we consider the high holy days in the Jewish calendar, on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, where we kind of launched a program that we're now involved in, where we're partnering with a local public elementary school, Reynolds Elementary School.
Nice.
And we're reaching out to give them support and to partner with them to whatever we can do to help. But hopefully, the idea is also to build a relationship with that community so that we get to know them and they get to know us, and we can understand more what their life is like, and we'll learn from each other. And the idea, for those who know about Stephen Kleinberg at Rice University, he's been writing about the population of Houston, Texas for decades. And he's ever since I've been here, which is now, over 20 years, every year he comes and says, we are the most diverse city in the country, but we also live in our own little silos. We don't venture out too much to see what the rest of the diverse city looks like. And so this is an opportunity for our congregation to get out of our silo and see another neighborhood, and thereby love our neighbors, as we're going to talk about tonight, a little broader. But we also realized as we were planning this, that this is 2 days after Election Day. We didn't know whether we'd have a new president yet or not, but we figured the country's been very divided, maybe divided more than along any other lines than by political lines. And so post-election, we thought this would be a good topic to discuss about how to repair relationships with our neighbors who may have different political views. So as I started out by saying, love your neighbor as yourself is an important commandment in the Jewish tradition, as we'll talk about. It's also important in Christianity. It's found in the New Testament. And so we decided to start the conversation off by looking at how that commandment is found in the New Testament. And then I'll give a little Jewish background for how I read that text in the New Testament. So now we're going to turn it over to my expert in the New Testament for the evening, Reverend Johnie Jones.
Well, first and foremost, let me say, how excited I am to have this private conversation publicly with you, first and foremost. And secondly, I don't consider myself an expert. However, I do think that this is a worthwhile and timely conversation to have, given all that's taking place in our country, in our world, right? And so what we're going to be looking at today, folks, is the book of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
yeah. So 25 through 37. And just let me give you just a bit of context for this text that we're going to be looking at. So from the Christian perspective, in the Christian Bible, we have 4 Gospels, okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These Gospels ultimately highlight or recount the life of Jesus. And so as you all know, or many of you may know, that as Christians, we believe, that Jesus, was the Messiah of the world. But here's what's more important for our conversation today is that, out of those four gospels, right, there are three that are considered the synoptic gospels. Synoptic coming from the Latin term seen together. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke essentially narrate the same or a very similar story about Jesus's life while he was here on earth. But what I want to highlight and segue into Luke is that each of those writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are essentially speaking to very specific audiences, and also have a very specific aim in which they want to get across to the audience that they're speaking to. So for example, Matthew is speaking to a very Jewish audience. So he's not, describing things in great detail, right? Because he assumes his audience is very much in the know of, the storyline as it relates to Jesus. Whereas Luke, which we're going into, is not Jewish. He's not all, and he's also not speaking to a Jewish audience. He's speaking to a more so what they call Gentile audience. So a group that's outside of the Jewish community. He's speaking to folks that are outside of the Jewish community. And so, so he's being more explanatory, if you will, in his description of the life of Jesus. And so what we're looking at here is a very fundamental piece of scripture that I think is fundamental to both Christians and Jews. Would you agree with that,
Yes,
Rabbi?
yeah, and it's found, I understand it's found in the other three synoptic gospels, but only this first part of it is found in a slightly different form. Each of them tell the story slightly differently, but only this first part is. So why don't we take a look at this first part and see what it says.
Sure thing. And I'll read this. And so I'm reading from what's called the New Revised Standard Version.
Right,
And I've broken it
translation.
out. This is the translation of this version. I've broken it out so that it's conversational and not necessarily, in a Bible. And so here it says in verse 25, the expert trying to test Jesus, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus responds, well, what is written in the law? What do you read there? The expert responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus responds, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. Oh, the expert, wanting to justify himself, asks a follow-up question. And who is my neighbor, Rabbi?
And so that sort of introduces the second part, which we'll get to in a bit. So here's how I kind of read this as a Jewish person, kind of looking at the text. Jews are used to reading texts and looking very carefully at each word, and then and parsing the meaning, and also sometimes finding different meanings in the same words, interpreting things many different ways. So the first thing I noticed about this was that this is the expert is trying to test Jesus. And as we talked about in our conversations, I'm not exactly sure what he was testing. Was he trying to see if Jesus knew what the law was? Because this is from the Jewish perspective, these are two pretty commonly known laws. Was he testing him thinking that Jesus was going to give some out of the box answer, something non-normative? But that part just kind of was confusing. And I looked in some commentaries, I couldn't really, it seemed like nobody seemed to be interested in that question. So, so we'll skip that part. But so Jesus, what's interesting, the next thing that's interesting, I thought, was that Jesus turns it back to him and says, well, what do you think is the most important commandment? What did you learn? And so that, as we talked about in our conversations, kind of hints that, what Jesus is going to say in the other two gospels, he says himself. He gives the answer himself. Here he's asking the person who's asking him the question, and he turns back to him, what do you think it is? and the other person answers the same thing that Jesus would have answered, which kind of indicates this was a kind of a well-known idea that these two commandments, and they're two separate commandments, love your neighbor as yourself, comes from Leviticus 19:18, and love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength comes from Deuteronomy. But apparently, in the Jewish world, in the time of Jesus, these two commandments were already pretty closely associated with each other, so that if Jesus had asked, was asking him, well, what do you think? And he gives a kind of classic answer, apparently. And I would say it's a pretty although we don't have a source now in the Jewish world that says this exact answer, it's a pretty good answer for what the essence of Judaism is. Love God and love your fellow human being. And Jesus says that's the good answer, do this and live. And I think, as we're going to see in the next couple slides, Jewish sources that say similar kinds of things. We obviously don't quote Jesus, and this is not a source for us, but we do have rabbinic sources that say very similar things. So do you have the next?
Sure, but and before we move forward, okay. I just wanted to say, Rabbi, I think one of the things that we should at least highlight before we move on is that I think it's imperative that we as Christians who read this text be careful and sensitive, not as to read this particular text as anti-Jewish.
Right.
Right. Is there anything you want to say in regards to that?
I think it doesn't, except for the question about what it means when he's testing Jesus. I mean, there's a potential thing for reading that there as some kind of this Jewish guy's trying to trick. But remember that Jesus is also Jewish. I mean, I think that's important to remember. so that this is an intramural discussion.
Right. It was essentially a common question of rabbis of this day,
correct.
Right?
That's
this isn't something out of the norm. This is something that essentially any rabbi would be questioned to see what is it that you consider to be,
right.
the most important laws of the Torah of this time.
Right. Many people back then were like peasant farmers, for instance. They'd be working all day. And when we read the 5 books of Moses, you can see that there's hundreds of commandments. We say there's 613. I'm not fixed on that number, but that's the number our tradition says. But there are clearly hundreds of commandments in there. And the average Jew doesn't have the time to study these things, So he goes to a scholar and he says, look, Rabbi, I don't have time to learn all of this. You're the scholar. Tell me what I need to know in a soundbite so I can go back to my work. Right. Tell me what's the essence of what I need to do to be a good person here. And that question was being asked and similar answers were being given.
Yes. And before we move on, I just want to, as a housekeeping for those that are participating, first and foremost, thank you all for tuning in today to a private conversation that has gone public about what does it mean to love our neighbor. Secondly, if you have any questions, feel free to put those questions into the chat box. And our very own Jennifer is going to make sure that Rabbi Morgen and I answer those at the question and answer section. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to part B of this love your neighbor conversation. And so you had mentioned, Rabbi, two important texts that part A hinges on, which is Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 9. Do you want to unpack that, or do you want us to continue?
I'll just briefly do that. So this is a passage that Jews read twice every day. It starts out with something we all Jews know how to say in Hebrew: Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And it's followed immediately by that commandment: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. And then it says there's all these mnemonic devices to remind you to keep these words in your heart, right? Teach them diligently to your children, talk about them when you're at home and away. And then I put in boldface, when you lie down and when you rise up, which is the reason why we recite this paragraph every evening when we lie down and every morning when we wake up. but we also bind them as a sign on our hand, as if to say, with all our actions in the world, we will remember to love God. And we serve as a symbol on your forehead, so that in all our thoughts, and we keep it in our minds, again, and on a doorpost of our house, that we should love God. So this is clearly a central commandment in Judaism.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And so, yeah, so here's an example from the rabbinic literature. It's interesting. This is a case. Hillel, who is the generation right before Jesus, is asked by a pagan a very similar question. He says, I want to convert to Judaism. I want to become Jewish, but tell me what I need to know while I stand on one foot. Right. So basically, that's today we would say, what's your elevator speech? You know, or give me Judaism in a soundbite. Right. So Hillel says, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That's the entire Torah, right? The whole 5 books of Moses. The rest is commentary. Go and study. So here he's clearly indicating a principle that sounds a lot like love your neighbor as yourself. What's hateful to you, don't do to your fellow, right? That is the essence of the Torah. And this is Hillel, the generation before Jesus, being asked a similar question and giving a very similar answer. And in another source, the same Hillel says, be of the disciples of Aaron, that's Moses' brother, that loves peace, pursues peace, loves mankind, right? Loves everybody, right? And brings them close to Torah, brings them close to what we would say is wisdom, let's say.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think too, what I think is worth lifting up in this context is something that you and I have talked about before, is that, you know, one, this particular text, part A, I'm going to go back to it if I can. Part A of this text, right, which is, you know, love God, and then secondly, love your neighbor, is fundamental to both of our faiths, right?
Absolutely.
To both the Jewish and the Christian faith. But secondly, this isn't an easy feat.
That's
right?
true.
Would you agree? Especially
right.
In 2020.
Right. So one of the things that's asked in Jewish sources right away is, how do you command somebody to love somebody? How do you command an emotion? Like, how do you command somebody to feel something? That's yeah.
Right. Well,
So,
and then too, I want to lift up, you know, I've heard other Jewish scholars lift this point up, is that, you know, this particular point, when Jesus is making reference to Deuteronomy and Leviticus, it's almost as if it's an aspirational effort, right? It's aspirational in nature, but not necessarily achievable.
Right. And that we're certainly going to see in part B, right? When we get to part B, we're going to see Jesus really pushes the envelope on this. So,
yeah.
So maybe we should.
I'll go there and say, you know, I think it's something, and I just want to, you know, for our audience, you know, we have both Christian, Jewish, and, you know, agnostic tuning in today. And I would say, even for, you know, from the Christian perspective, our mindset or predilection or predisposition is that, you know, we believe that, you know, while this is something that is difficult, it's something that we can do, but within the strength that's given, or the empowerment of God, right? It's something that's only given to us through God's power. And so, you know, I'm excited that we'll be able to unpack this even more, you know, looking at the actual parable of the Good Samaritan. But I just wanted to highlight that from the Christian perspective.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So here's now Jesus is going to answer that question. The challenger asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" So he's going to do it in typical rabbinic. This is another classic rabbinic move, but of course we all learned it from the Greeks, right? From, you know, Aesop's fables, and, you know, that was just comparables were kind of the way of telling stories and passing on wisdom back then. So
right on. And as a preface to this particular parable, I want to read something from one of my favorite theologians, Dr. Howard Thurman. You know, in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, on his chapter 5 about love, this is what he says. He says, the religion of Jesus makes the love ethic central. This is no ordinary achievement. It seems clear that Jesus started out with a simple teaching concerning love embodied in the timeless words of Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might, and thy neighbor as thyself. And this is key, what I wanted to lift up for us before we go into this. He says, once the neighbor is defined, then one's moral obligation is clear. And here Jesus is talking to the expert in the law, and I broke it out in conversation so we can understand it. Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other on the side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged him with his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. And when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert replied, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus says then, go and do likewise.
Right. Did you want to make any comments on that, or?
Well, I mean, I think from the Christian perspective, just looking at this particular text from the outset, I think there are a number of things that we can outline for discussion today. And I'm a Baptist preacher in my training, so I'm going to try my best not to preach. But I can't help it if I get, a little bit excited. But the first thing that I want to notice or bring to the attention of our audience is that here a man, right, which I guess based off of what scholars have said, it could be a person of Jewish descent, is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Right, and fell into the hands of robbers. Well, this particular stretch of land is about 18 miles between Jerusalem and Jericho, and is about over 3,200 feet above sea level. Right, and it was also known as an area of that was wrought with thieves and robbers. So it was likely that many people traveling or traversing this particular path would have been somewhat skeptical, right, of going down this path. And I use that word skeptical for a reason, because I want to bring it back later. And what's interesting is,
well, skeptical. Let me just point out, skeptical because it's dangerous. And it's like if you're driving on the road and you see somebody on the side of the road and they seem to be having trouble with their car, your first instinct is probably want to help them. But some people are a little bit skittish, and they might say, particularly if it's dark outside and there's nobody else around, maybe this is a trick. Maybe they want me to get out of my car, and then they're going to beat me up and take my car or something, right? And so this guy was clearly walking down a place where there were robbers, and he was robbed, right? But it's also possible that somebody seeing him there might think, oh, he's the robber, and he's got friends behind the bushes somewhere or something.
Exactly, which is the second part that I want to lift up for our audience is here is that when you see the priest walking down this path and the Levite, and I want you to even kind of talk a little bit about their roles, right, their functions in the temple before I even get into that, to just kind of set the stage and tone of who these people are that are passing by.
Right. So first of all, when a Jew reads this story, And a Jew familiar with Jewish texts knows that in Jewish texts, the trio is always a priest, a Levite, and an Israelite. A Cohen, a Levi, a Yisrael. Cohen is a priest, Levi is from the tribe of Levi, and a Yisrael is from one of the other tribes. And that's the trio, right? So in Jesus' story here, he intentionally throws you by changing it from a priest, a Levite, and a Yisrael to a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And the Samaritans were not exactly on the best relations with the Jews at the time. Like, they were kind of like distant cousins that you don't want to invite to your Thanksgiving dinner.
Right.
I mean, and sometimes they had better relations, sometimes worse relations. They kind of shared sort of many of the same traditions and a similar text, but the Samaritans had a different Torah that they claimed was the authentic one, and ours was wrong. Right, so we're like fighting about stuff like that. So we're not necessarily best of friends. And he's the one that Jesus chooses to be the third person, not the Israelite. Right, so it's somewhat of an outsider, not a total outsider, and someone that you may not like. So, in fact, in the conversation today, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but today we might say, Republicans and Democrats. Do you check the guy? Is he from the party, that you support, or is maybe if he's from the other party, I don't really care if he's if he got robbed. God forbid, right? But I think that's the kind of thing you should have in mind, in your mind when you read the story of the Good Samaritan. This is a person who I'm politically not so friendly with.
Right. Well, and I think even to add some color to this context that you're providing is that if you look at sort of the Christian Bible, just a few chapters before this one in the book of Luke, the disciples of Jesus are asking Jesus, hey, can we call down fire from heaven on a particular Samaritan town, to just show you the tension between the Samaritans and Jews at this particular time, which I find very interesting in the fact that Jesus is now inserting a Samaritan into this story,
right,
amongst other Jews.
Right, exactly right. That's right. And that's an important thing to remember, is that this is a story told among Jews, right? So, and this is the part where it potentially might be read as anti-Semitic, right? Because the two Jewish people, the priest and the Levite, who have positions of importance and you would think would be respectable and would do the right thing, they're the ones who go the other side of the road to try to ignore the guy. And the Samaritan, sort of the semi-outcast, the semi, frenemy, right, is the one who stops and says, well, I have to go help this guy. And by the way, the next thing that I read in this story is he doesn't just help the guy, right? So the wine is, first of all, alcohol is an antiseptic. Right. The oil is to help the wound to heal, right? So, I mean, these are each then bandage. This is like ancient medicine. He puts him on his own animal. It's like putting him in his car, right? And taking him to the hotel, and he takes care of him there. And he pays for him to stay overnight. And the next day he goes to the innkeeper and he pays him a whole bunch more money. And he says, take care of this guy until I come back. And if you end up spending more money than what I gave you, I'll make it up to you. I'll pay you back whatever your losses are. I mean, this guy is going way, way, way beyond what a normal person might do. Today we might call 911 and feel that we did the right thing. This guy drove him to the hospital, paid the doctor bill.
Right.
It's an unbelievable thing what he did here, and that's where it's very aspirational. Jesus is really pushing the envelope here with this.
Well, and I want to ask you, as it relates to that, just talking about this neighbor, right? Because here, Jesus clearly says, or the expert rather says clearly, who is my neighbor, right? And so I want to pose to you, Rabbi, like, is it easy, even in 2020, for us as both Christians and Jews, or people who desire to do right by humanity? Is it easy for us to identify who our neighbor is?
Yeah, so there's always people who try to restrict that definition of neighbor. Well, the people who live on my block, or the people who go to my church, or the people who go to my synagogue. But
right.
That's the problem, that Stephen Kleinberg points out in his population studies all the time. We live in our own silos, and if you just think of your neighbors as the people in your silo, I mean, we live in a big city,
Mm-hmm.
and the health of the city, particularly in a time of this virus, right, depends on all of us cooperating with each other, because we all come in contact with each other. We all meet each other. We all have needs that we rely on each other for. And
Mm-hmm.
our neighborhood's pretty big right now, even if we're
Yeah.
isolating in our own homes a lot of, like I am, like I'm spending a lot of my time in my own home, but I rely on people who are out there, and they're all my neighbors.
Hmm. Well, and I think too, from the Christian perspective, I think, one of the things that is rings true for us is that we have to be careful in, defining, or narrowly defining
Right,
who the neighbor is,
right,
right? Because in my perspective, and I'm no scholar, but this is just my personal perspective. If I'm defining who my neighbor is, then I get to dictate, the mercy
who I'm going
and
to
the
show. Right, yeah,
grace,
right,
you know what I mean, and the preferential treatment that I give to an individual,
right,
right? Versus, this is something, as we alluded to earlier, this is the hard thing that God is calling
right.
us and asking us to do.
So, right. So the thing this parable does, and it's very cleverly done, in my opinion, is he pushes the envelope in two ways. First of all, he pushes the envelope in defining who the neighbor is. It's not just the Cohen, the Levi, and the Israel, the priest, the
Mhm.
Levite, and the Israel. It's also the Samaritans, right? Those guys down the street or in the other village. And secondly, the character of what does it mean to love your neighbor,
Wow.
right? Because clearly
Mhm.
he's telling about how the Samaritan went so far out of his way to help this other person, to demonstrate to you what it means to love somebody,
Mhm.
right? To
Mhm.
really love somebody means to really care about their welfare. And now this is where we talk about aspirational. Are normal people going to do this? Probably not, right? I don't know very many people who would do this,
Mhm.
but it's something to aspire to. It's something to keep in mind should you want to do what the priest and the Levite did, which is to turn aside.
Right.
And
Mm.
and on that point, I want to add one other thought, which, again, having a Jewish lens on this, there
Mhm.
are one or two commandments in Deuteronomy. I was going to look this up before tonight and I forgot, but I believe there's two commandments in Deuteronomy where it specifically said, "You shall not turn aside." Right.
Mm.
One of them is if you see a lost object of your neighbor's lying in the street, you have an obligation to return it to your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
And it says, do not turn aside. Don't pretend you didn't see it, right? You have to
Mhm.
pick it up and figure out who it belongs to and get it back to that person. You have a responsibility to do that. You cannot turn aside. And I think the other
Mhm.
one was about a donkey struggling under its burden, but somebody will probably look it up while we're on and correct me. But I think it was, if you see a donkey struggling under its burden, you need to help that donkey. You cannot turn aside. In any
Mhm.
case, it's at least once. And I get a hint of that the way Jesus
Mhm.
is telling the story. The Levite
Right.
and the priest turned away, right?
Mm.
That's something you're not allowed to do.
Right. Right. Oh, and I think here, what's interesting, or at least, I want to sort of dive into for just a second, this passage compels us to do the hard thing, right? Showing mercy to someone who, if you look at the relationship or historical relationship between the Samaritan and the Jewish person, it does not, this Jewish person does not necessarily deserve the Samaritan's mercy,
The person who
right?
got robbed, right?
Right. The
Yeah,
person who got robbed doesn't
right,
necessarily deserve the
right,
Samaritan's mercy,
right.
right? And I think that's important to lift up, because in a different power differential, it's easy to say, oh, if I'm in the position to provide you the mercy, the grace, because I have the power, right? That's the easy thing to do. But I think what God is, or Jesus here in this particular text is asking us to do is, what does it look like to provide mercy, to extend mercy and grace to individuals who in your mind, or in the public's mind, or in culture's mind, are undeserving, right? And I think in light of what's going on today, right?
Right.
All of the uncertainty, all of the angst, all of the
Right.
unrest
Right.
taking place, not only in across our country, the breadth and width of our country, but also around our world, right? There are many individuals who claim, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit, who claim to love God, yet spew so much hatred towards their fellow brother and sister. And
Right.
here's the thing. My role or responsibility or response to that action is simply to extend mercy and grace to that individual,
Right.
right? And that's hard. I
That's
love
hard.
how you put it. It's aspirational at best.
Right.
But I feel like there is this sort of groundswell of individuals that we can thrive off of their energy and resilience so that we can continue to fight back hate with love. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yes. Right. I think that's exactly what this is trying to get us to do. And I think in the polarized world that we live in, this is such an important message. We're all neighbors, right? And we
Yeah.
all have, our faith traditions teach us we need to show love to our neighbors, even when we disagree about political matters or religious matters or economic matters. We need to find a way to understand each other, to love each other, to
Mm.
respect each other.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, we didn't talk about this, in previous time, but I want to ask you, Rabbi, why do you think it's so hard for us to see each other as neighbor, to have conversation with each
Yeah.
other? You know what I mean?
Right.
And
Well,
come to that table of unity.
I think clearly what this election has shown us is that we are a deeply divided country,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
there are two very, very different perspectives on politics and economics and so on. And I think it's going to be very dangerous
Hmm.
for us as a country to continue to be so polarized, and because the
Hmm.
more polarized we get, the more angry everybody gets, and the less people want to listen to each other.
Hmm.
And and these are obviously, again, it's there may be hard conversations because we're easy. I know I am easily excited, and I have to remind myself to stay calm. And but really listen to somebody. What is your concern? What is it that motivates you? What is it that bothers you? One of the
Hmm.
stories I told in my Rosh Hashanah sermon was told by Joseph Telushkin in his book on Jewish values. He
Hmm.
he tells a story that's a Hasidic story about two guys who are in a bar, and one guy says to the other guy, "Do you love me?" And the other guy says, "Sure, I love you." And the first guy says, "Well, do you know what hurts me?" The other
Hmm.
guy says, "No, I don't." So then the first guy says, "Well, you say you love me, but if you don't know what hurts me, how can you say you love me?"
Hmm.
Right? Um, and we really need to listen to each other. What hurts you? What is motivating you? What makes you upset? What would you like to see?
Hmm.
And maybe we can talk through some of these things and work past, because we do need to come together somehow, one way or another. Whoever wins the presidency, we need to find a way to get together.
Hmm. No, I certainly agree with that. And, I think that it brings us to the part of the conversation, because we're running low on time, you know, to 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 the question that Jesus asks the expert at the sort of tail end of this parable. He says, who in these three, right? Not an indictment on the priest and the Levite, right? So let's be clear about that. But he says, who in these three was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robber? Well,
Right.
and it's interesting that the expert, knowing that Jesus has highlighted, you know, that it's a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan, doesn't even mention the Samaritan's name. He doesn't
Right,
even
doesn't
say. He
call him
said
by name, right?
he doesn't call him by name, but he says, "Well, the one who showed him mercy."
Right.
And I think this is an opportunity where Jesus extends grace even to the expert and says, "Look, I'm not gonna fault you for not even mentioning the Samaritan's name. All I'm gonna encourage you to do is go and do likewise." And
Right.
so I think I want to pivot our conversation to say, I mean, what does it look like for
Right.
us, as people of faith, to extend love and mercy and
Right.
grace to
Right.
people
Right.
who don't necessarily think like us, who don't necessarily look like us, who don't necessarily, vote
Right.
like us, right? You know what I mean? What does it look like for us to extend love to them? And I'll segue, a little bit by just, quoting Dr. Martin Luther King, who's one of my favorites. He says, "Listen, I have decided to stick with love because hate is too great a burden to bear." Right. So if had I seen the man, and he even preached a message specifically on, the Good Samaritan. He said, had I seen the man who was stricken on the side of the road, love would compel me to at least go and see about his needs, right? And I
Right.
think there's something to be said even about the Samaritan that, that can be unpacked here in the story. The Samaritan draws near to the man in need, regardless of the skepticism or rhetoric of the particular stretch of road that he's traveling down, right? Whereas the priest and the Levite have, as you alluded to earlier, have turned aside.
Right.
Right. They've moved on the other side because they say, you know what, listen, this might be a trap. This ain't right. Biden ain't, you know, the most, beneficial for us, or Trump isn't the most beneficial for whatever that skepticism or rhetoric is. It causes them to distance themselves from this individual versus drawing near or closer to this individual.
Right.
Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's flip to slide 9.
Okay.
And I just want to bring this other Jewish source before we close. The one after that, that was an important one. It's also, there's a commandment to love the stranger as well as your neighbor. That was in Leviticus 19:34. But then go the next one after
And
that.
one more. Okay.
Yeah, keep going. And it's right before that one, I guess.
Is it this one?
Who is a hero? The one right after that one.
Okay.
Should be, whoop, is it? Oh, what's the one where Rabbi Akiva? There it is. Rabbi
Mm.
Akiva and Ben Azai. So this is actually
Ooh.
about 100 years after Jesus.
Yeah.
Rabbi Akiva lived about 100 years after Jesus, a famous rabbi in the Talmud. And he basically does say what Jesus said, that love your neighbor as yourself is one of the essential commandments in the entire 5 books of Moses. This is a very important principle of the Torah, he says. But his colleague, Ben Azai, said that he thought this other verse was more important than that. He said,
Mm.
"This is the book of the descendants of Adam. In the day that God created Adam, in the image of God, he made him." He said,
Mm.
that's a more important verse. Why? First of all, it's universal. We're all human beings. We're all descendants of Adam. So it's not just your neighbor anymore. This is for sure talking about all human beings. But secondly, and he says, you should realize that if you want to shame your neighbor, if you should know whom you're shaming, right? An image of God, right? So you
Mm.
should look into the eyes of the person you're staring at there, look into their eyes and see that spark of godliness, that spark of holiness in them,
Mm-hmm.
and then treat them accordingly. And if you do that, right, then you will be, loving your neighbor. That's what really will inspire you to do the right thing, to take care of everybody, and to treat them appropriately.
Yeah.
So this is a statement in the Talmud, and again, this is a section that's often quoted in Jewish circles. So it's kind of the parallel, I would say, to the parable of the rabbi of this Good Samaritan in the Jewish world.
Yeah. I think to that point, one of the sermons that I've preached back in the day when I was, all about preaching was this sort of love ethic of Jesus, right? So there's a particular passage called the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is teaching people, and there are a number of, what do you call them, principles that Jesus is trying to articulate to the people in the audience. And one of the things that I admire about this is he's talking about sort of the disposition of a person's heart, right? He says, you've heard it said that, thou shalt not murder. But let's take it a step further. If you hate your brother, you've already committed murder in your heart. And that's very
aspirational.
Right. Again, right. Yeah. No, I get it. That's aspirational. But that to me says, it means, hey, you're moving beyond just the material world here, right? In saying that there's something going on internally. Right. So even though they may still be living and breathing internally,
if you really hate them, it's like you're killing them in your mind.
In your mind, they're gone. Right. And he's saying, no. You're supposed to see them differently. And this is what I love about this particular passage that you lift up, because I also believe it, that we are all image bearers of God. And I preached a sermon, one of the points that I talked about was, and Jesus even said this, how can you love God whom you've not seen, yet hate your brother whom you see every day, if we are all image bearers? Right. You know what I mean? And so as a result, this goes back to something that you alluded to earlier, and I love this. It's all about seeing my neighbor, right? I first have to see my neighbor as an image bearer of God and not necessarily an other. Right. So when I see a Democrat or a Republican as other, then I can treat them as other. Right. But I can treat them, inhumanely, or I can treat them accordingly. But when I see them as an image bearer of God, then I have a responsibility, to treat them in accordance with, one, how I want to be treated, but two, which is actually one, how God has required me to treat this individual.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. And that's basically what both of our traditions are teaching. And that's why we chose this topic for this evening. So why don't we see now if there's any questions that anybody has. There was one from Darlene. She asked about the priest and the Levite who went down the other side of the road. Yeah, one of the common thoughts that people have is, well, they couldn't come in contact with the dead, and that's why they did that. But the truth is that first so it's possible if they were going up towards Jerusalem, they would have to be in a state of ritual purity when they get to the Temple Mount. And so they may not have wanted to, if you come in contact with a dead body, you're no longer in a state of ritual purity. But the way Jesus told the story, they're coming down from Jerusalem towards Jericho. So they're going away from the temple. And so in that case, people got into states of ritual impurity frequently in those days. It was a concern the Jews had. And there's ways to fix it. You immerse in a mikveh, you immerse in a water, and you wait a day, and you're clean again. So priests were not supposed to come in contact with dead bodies necessarily, but if it was a case like this where there's a body on the side of the road, the Jewish law is that they would be required to bury the body. So in that case, they were required to come in contact with the dead because the more important commandment was to bury the dead. And so probably that, although that's a commonly read kind of interpretation of why they might have turned aside, That's probably not it. My guess is Jesus was using the priest and the Levite partly because it was a common motif of priest, Levite, Yisrael, and he wanted to switch it up. And maybe there was a bit of, well, these are important. These are people who might have thought they were too important to get involved in this matter. Although they have positions of responsibility and authority, and they should get involved, right? They may have felt like, well, this is beneath me, so I'll let somebody else deal with it. I'm not sure, but it's not clear. But what we don't want to do is read it as an anti-Semitic text, that the Jews neglected this guy and the Samaritan, as if to say all Jews would neglect this guy and only the foreigners would care about that. That's not the message Jesus wanted to tell. He was Jewish himself.
Well, and I think two things to lift up, and please forgive me, Rabbi, if you've already, articulated this. One, Ann Jill Levine, who is a Christian and Jewish scholar that I absolutely revere, and is part of writing the New Testament Jewish commentary to the New Testament. Jewish commentary of the New Testament talks about how well, in actuality, the priest and the Levite are coming down the mountain, from Jericho, not going up, right? Or coming down the mountain from Jerusalem, to Jericho, not going up. So it wasn't a big deal about religious purity or ritual purity. It might have been that it was just that skepticism,
and it could have been skepticism, right? That's another thing too, right?
Yeah, and
they could have just been stand-ins, right? It's like Harry, Jerry, and Mo. It's what So Harry passes by, Jerry passes by, and Mo's the one who stopped. I mean, it could have been that simple. We don't know.
Right. Well, and it's so funny. I was reading the autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King, and he says, there's a part where he and his wife, Coretta Scott King, went to this particular part of town, and they were driving down that particular area of town, and he says he just sort of remarks about how the landscape is and how sort of weaving it is, and he couldn't help but remember all of the crevices, right, in the areas that
people could be hiding out
in, right? And so there was this, I think it was a common notion that this was a particular dangerous part of town, and not just in the sense of thieves and robbers, but also just sort of the windiness of on the side of this mountain, right?
And so that's another thing which maybe will be a topic for another conversation. But we do have this sort of primitive mind that sort of we in primitive times we had to make snap decisions about fight or flight, right? Fight or flight, right? If we see something that looks scary, what we have to make an instant decision about what to do. And we make snap judgments, and they could often be wrong because we've misanalyzed what the problem is, and that is something that we deal with in society today. You see somebody coming at you down the street, and are you afraid of that person? Why are you afraid of that person? What is it about that person scares you? And are you justified? Maybe you may be justified in being scared, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're not. And
right.
We have to pause and use our rational brains to see all the evidence, to try and understand, look in their eyes, see who they are, really, to see them as people.
Yeah, Jennifer just posted it into the group. Many, if not all, religions teach that we should love others unconditionally. In this country, the issue that keeps us apart is racial inequality and injustice. The issue of racism continues to keep us apart because it is a form of dehumanization that does not see the other as human. Most white people, like me, are unaware of the stereotypes and assumptions that we are indoctrinated with throughout our lives. The vitriol of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism is something many have to become aware of to resolve it. It takes a lot of looking inside of ourselves. And I agree. And I think one of the things that I would say, just using this particular text, is that we all have to take on the disposition of the Samaritan, and I'll get into just sort of unpacking that theologically in just a second, we all have to take on the position or disposition of the Samaritan, of the willingness to go to the other, to seek out, engage
Right.
others in thoughtful dialogue, seeking to understand, not necessarily to be understood. Right. And I
Right.
think that's where we run amiss kind of in today's society. Everybody wants to be heard. You and I talked about this. Everybody
Right.
wants to be heard. Everybody wants to persuade the other to our side, versus saying, you know what, let me just better understand the perspective you're coming from so that I can better understand you and understand how I might interact, engage with you. But here's what I believe, and I shared this with someone, a long time ago. Is the fear is that if I avail myself to the vulnerability of ignorance, there's a slight chance that I might be persuaded to your side. And the fear of losing myself, my identity,
Right. Because I'm going to end up agreeing with you.
exactly, is greater, you see what I'm saying, than me just trying to pull you to my side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's a hesitancy maybe of that, or maybe a hesitancy of really believing that the other person wants to hear my side of the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or and so you really have to be honest about that. I do really want to hear what you're thinking. What is it that motivates you? Why do you think what you think? What are the sources of your information? How do you unpack the various things that are going on in the world right now? Where
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also there's another serious problem, I think, which is what I see today is very binary thinking.
Mm,
If you're not with me, you're against me. If you're not
mm,
the A, you're the opposite of A. You're just
mm-hmm.
not B, you're the opposite of A.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we have to get away from binary thinking and realizing that most people are not at the extremes.
Right.
Most people are in the middle.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions? Does anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming and participating in this. It is recorded,
Mm-hmm.
and we will be posting it if you want to check back with us, and if other, people who might be interested in watching it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. We certainly enjoyed working together and preparing this.
Yeah.
And hopefully we all got something out of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I hope that, from my perspective, that at the end of this discussion, you too will go and do likewise.
Yes.
Extend mercy to
the other.
Right, to the other. So thank you so much, you all, for your time and even your support tonight. So.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Jones. It's been great doing that. I'm sure we'll do more in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. Well, you've got me as a friend for life, so you can't get rid of me that easily. So
perfect. All right. Thank you all for coming. By the way, that's Yale Divinity School Library in the background there.
This is right. I spent many a night in this library studying for very difficult papers that I did not pass, but that's okay. That's okay. I graduated, so that's all that matters.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and I hope you all have a good evening. And let's keep working at trying to get together.
Awesome. Take care, guys.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.